April 8, 1943. For 2 feet above Forges-aux-France, the oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Heinz Noak's smirk as he banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109G, the sleek fighter, responding to his touch like an extension of his own body. Below him, through the crystal-clear canopy, he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader, one a man with hundreds of combat hours over Russia and the English Channel, studied the new American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. They were enormous barrel-chested with wings that seemed too stubby for their massive fuselages. They climbed with the grace of a freight train, their formations rigid and slow-burning precious fuel just to keep pace in the thin, frigid air. Noak keyed his transmitter, his voice laced with the casual contempt of a predator observing new clumsy prey. "Look at them," he broadcast to his wingmen. "Die Amos have sent us flying milk bottles." Laughter crackled back over the radio. The sentiment was shared across the entire Luftwaffe fighter arm. For weeks, intelligence reports had described this new American fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The specifications alone were a source of amusement in German ready rooms. A single-engine fighter that weighed nearly 7 tons fully loaded. It was heavier than some of their twin-engine bombers. 6 miles below, inside the cramped cockpit of one of those milk bottles, Lieutenant Frank Perego of the 4th Fighter Group felt nothing but cold, suffocating fear. His hands, slick with sweat inside his leather gloves, gripped the control stick of his P-47C. The aircraft felt heavy, unresponsive, a beast of a machine that vibrated with the barely contained fury of its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney double wasp engine. Perego, like most of the American pilots in the sky that day, was a novice. He had trained for months, but nothing could prepare him for this. The sky was a vast, empty blue expanse, yet he felt a terrifying claustrophobia, the certainty that death was watching him from somewhere just beyond his vision. His eyes scanned the instruments, the sky, his wingman, then the sky again. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep thrumming roar of the engine. He and his comrades had been told they were the best-trained pilots in the world, flying the most powerful fighter ever built. But as he struggled to hold formation, watching his airspeed indicator bleed off with every foot of altitude gained, he felt like a swimmer fighting a current, being pulled inexorably into a killing zone. They were the bait. And above them, the wolves were circling. What Heinz Noak and his fellow aces couldn't know, what no one in the German high command could have possibly imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the very weapon that would systematically hunt, terrorize, and annihilate the Luftwaffe. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of total destruction. The 8 half-inch Browning machine guns nestled in those broad wings would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of annihilation were already loaded into their ammunition bays, 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing, incendiary shells, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. But on this freezing April morning, that future was an impossible fantasy. The reality was a formation of terrified young Americans in an untested, unloved aircraft flying directly into the teeth of the most experienced and deadliest fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939. Their pilots were veterans of Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the brutal Eastern Front. The Americans had been in combat over Europe for exactly 0 days. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how a philosophy of brute force and survivability crushed a legacy of elegant dogfighting, and how German laughter turned to sheer terror as they discovered what a 7-ton juggernaut could do when it stopped trying to turn and simply pointed its nose straight down. The mission of April 8th was a fighter sweep a tentative probe into enemy territory designed to draw the Luftwaffe into a fight. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, led the formation. A former Eagle Squadron veteran, Blakesley had flown Spitfires with the RAF. He knew what a true dogfighter felt like: light, agile, responsive. This new American machine was the opposite of all that. He had seen the skepticism in his men's eyes. They'd heard the jokes from British pilots who claimed the only way to evade an enemy in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the cavernously large cockpit. Blakesley understood their fear because he shared their doubts. His new aircraft was twice the weight of the Spitfire he had loved, yet it was tasked with the same deadly mission. As he led his group toward the French coast, he knew survival depended on abandoning everything he and his men thought they knew about aerial combat. This was not a fencer's rapier, it was a blacksmith's hammer. The challenge was figuring out how to wield it before they were all killed. The Thunderbolt represented a radical, almost heretical departure from conventional fighter design. While the Germans and British had pursued lightweight interceptors, optimized for rate of climb and turning performance, Republic Aviation had created something entirely different, a high-altitude escort and interceptor that used mass, power, and overwhelming firepower to change the rules of the game. It was an aircraft born not from the tradition of graceful aerial duels, but from the cold, hard logic of American mass production and engineering philosophy. It wasn't built to outdance the enemy. It was built to obliterate them. But those theories meant nothing to the pilots climbing toward their baptism by fire. All they knew was that their aircraft felt sluggish. They knew that above them, the Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds of the Luftwaffe could climb faster, turn tighter, and were flown by men who considered the sky their personal hunting ground. The German pilots watched patient and confident. They saw the Americans holding their tight peacetime formations, a clear sign of inexperience. They saw the massive radial engines trailing thin streams of exhaust engines that required a labyrinth of complex ducting for their turbo superchargers, adding thousands of pounds of weight. They saw an aircraft designed by committee, a compromise built for a war its designers didn't seem to understand. The Germans held the altitude advantage, the experience advantage, and the performance advantage. Every instinct, every piece of data told them that the engagement to come would not be a battle, but a slaughter. They were right about the slaughter. They were just wrong about who was going to be the butcher. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt isn't just about a machine. It's about the clash of military philosophies and the terrifying discovery that all the old rules were about to be broken. The German pilots were laughing. The American pilots were praying. And the history of aerial warfare was about to be rewritten by a machine everyone believed was a mistake. To understand how this flying milk bottle became an instrument of annihilation, how its pilots achieved kill ratios that defied all logic, you first have to understand the terror and confusion of those first missions. To follow this incredible journey from doubt to dominance, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. April 8, 1943, First Mal to Maffring, First aux France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Heinz Noakes' smirk as he banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109G, the sleek fighter responding to his touch like an extension of his own body. Below him, through the crystal-clear canopy, he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran ace of Jägerschwader, a man with hundreds of combat hours over Russia and the English Channel, studied the new American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. They were enormous barrel-chested with wings that seemed too stubby for their massive fuselages. They climbed with the grace of a freight train, their formations rigid and slow-burning, precious fuel just to keep pace in the thin, frigid air. Noak keyed his transmitter, his voice laced with the casual contempt of a predator observing new, clumsy prey. "Look at them," he broadcast to his wingmen. "Die Amos have sent us flying milk bottles." Laughter crackled back over the radio. The sentiment was shared across the entire Luftwaffe fighter arm. For weeks, intelligence reports had described this new American fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The specifications alone were a source of amusement in German ready rooms. A single-engine fighter that weighed nearly 7 tons fully loaded. It was heavier than some of their twin-engine bombers. 6 miles below, inside the cramped cockpit of one of those milk bottles, Lieutenant Frank Perego of the 4th Fighter Group felt nothing but cold, suffocating fear. His hands, slick with sweat inside his leather gloves, gripped the control stick of his P-47C. The aircraft felt heavy, unresponsive, a beast of a machine that vibrated with the barely contained fury of its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine. Perego, like most of the American pilots in the sky that day, was a novice. He had trained for months, but nothing could prepare him for this. The sky was a vast, empty blue expanse, yet he felt a terrifying claustrophobia, the certainty that death was watching him from somewhere just beyond his vision. His eyes scanned the instruments, the sky, his wingman, then the sky again. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep thrumming roar of the engine. He and his comrades had been told they were the best trained pilots in the world, flying the most powerful fighter ever built. But as he struggled to hold formation, watching his airspeed indicator bleed off with every foot of altitude gained, he felt like a swimmer fighting a current being pulled inexorably into a killing zone. They were the bait. And above them, the wolves were circling. What Heinz Noke and his fellow aces couldn't know, what no one in the German high command could have possibly imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the very weapon that would systematically hunt, terrorize, and annihilate the Luftwaffe. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of total destruction. The 8 half-inch Browning machine guns nestled in those broad wings would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of annihilation were already loaded into their ammunition bays: 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary shells, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. But on this freezing April morning, that future was an impossible fantasy. The reality was a formation of terrified young Americans in an untested, unloved aircraft flying directly into the teeth of the most experienced and deadliest fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939. Their pilots were veterans of Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the brutal Eastern Front. The Americans had been in combat over Europe for exactly 0 days. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how a philosophy of brute force and survivability crushed a legacy of elegant dogfighting, and how German laughter turned to sheer terror as they discovered what a 7-ton juggernaut could do when it stopped trying to turn and simply pointed its nose straight down. The mission of April 8th was a fighter sweep, a tentative probe into enemy territory designed to draw the Luftwaffe into a fight. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, led the formation. A former Eagle Squadron veteran, Blakesley had flown Spitfires with the RAF. He knew what a true dogfighter felt like: light, agile, responsive. This new American machine was the opposite of all that. He had seen the skepticism in his men's eyes. They'd heard the jokes from British pilots who claimed the only way to evade an enemy in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the cavernously large cockpit. Blakesley understood their fear because he shared their doubts. His new aircraft was twice the weight of the Spitfire he had loved, yet it was tasked with the same deadly mission. As he led his group toward the French coast, he knew survival depended on abandoning everything he and his men thought they knew about aerial combat. This was not a fencer's rapier. It was a blacksmith's hammer. The challenge was figuring out how to wield it before they were all killed. The Thunderbolt represented a radical, almost heretical departure from conventional fighter design. While the Germans and British had pursued lightweight interceptors, optimized for rate of climb and turning performance, Republic Aviation had created something entirely different: a high-altitude escort and interceptor that used mass, power, and overwhelming firepower to change the rules of the game. It was an aircraft born not from the tradition of graceful aerial duels, but from the cold, hard logic of American mass production and engineering philosophy. It wasn't built to outdance the enemy, it was built to obliterate them. But those theories meant nothing to the pilots climbing toward their baptism by fire. All they knew was that their aircraft felt sluggish. They knew that above them, the Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds of the Luftwaffe could climb faster, turn tighter, and were flown by men who considered the sky their personal hunting ground. The German pilots watched patient and confident. They saw the Americans holding their tight peacetime formations, a clear sign of inexperience. They saw the massive radial engines trailing thin streams of exhaust engines that required a labyrinth of complex ducting for their turbo superchargers, adding thousands of pounds of weight. They saw an aircraft designed by committee, a compromise built for a war its designers didn't seem to understand. The Germans held the altitude advantage, the experience advantage, and the performance advantage. Every instinct, every piece of data told them that the engagement to come would not be a battle but a slaughter. They were right about the slaughter. They were just wrong about who was going to be the butcher. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt isn't just about a machine. It's about the clash of military philosophies and the terrifying discovery that all the old rules were about to be broken. The German pilots were laughing. The American pilots were praying. And the history of aerial warfare was about to be rewritten by a machine everyone believed was a mistake. To understand how this flying milk bottle became an instrument of annihilation, how its pilots achieved kill ratios that defied all logic, you first have to understand the terror and confusion of those first missions. To follow this incredible journey from doubt to dominance, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt does not begin in the skies over France, but in a state of quiet panic in the summer of 1940. As the German Blitzkrieg swept across Europe, crushing armies with terrifying speed, the United States Army Air Corps looked at its own inventory of aircraft and saw a fleet of obsolete, underpowered machines, wholly incapable of challenging the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that now dominated the continent. A desperate request was sent to America's leading aircraft manufacturers for a new high-altitude interceptor, one that could meet the Luftwaffe on its own terms. At Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, a brilliant Georgian-born chief designer named Alexander Kartveli received the specifications. He studied the numbers, the performance requirements, and the lessons being learned in the brutal air war over Britain. Then he and his team began to design a fighter based on a philosophy so radically different from European convention that it was seen by many as pure insanity. Kartveli famously sketched the P-47's initial design on a train after learning his previous project was canceled. Looking at the immense barrel-shaped fuselage required to house the engine and its revolutionary support systems, he admitted to his design team, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The dinosaur was built around a single, uncompromising component, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This was not merely an engine, it was a technological marvel, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial behemoth that could generate a staggering 2,000 horsepower. It was at the time the most powerful aircraft engine in the world, but raw power at sea level meant nothing in the high-altitude battlegrounds of the European theater. The true genius and the source of the P-47's immense size and weight was the complex system designed to keep that engine breathing in the thin, frozen air 6 miles above the Earth. Kartveli's team didn't just give the P-47 an engine, they built an entire life support system for it. The key was a sophisticated turbo supercharger, a device that used the engine's own hot exhaust gases to spin a turbine at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine drove a compressor that forced dense, pressurized air back into the engine, allowing it to maintain its full 2,000 horsepower output at altitudes of 27,000 feet and beyond. It was a closed-loop system of immense power and complexity, but it came at a staggering cost in weight and space. The turbocharger itself was located deep in the rear fuselage, which gave the aircraft its distinctive, almost pregnant appearance. To feed it, a vast and intricate network of ducting had to be routed from the engine, running along both sides of the cockpit to the turbine in the tail, and then back forward through an intercooler system to the engine's intake. This ductwork alone added over 1,000 pounds to the aircraft's weight and dictated its enormous size. When the prototype, the XP-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941, it shocked everyone who saw it. With an empty weight of nearly 1,000 pounds, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor. Test pilots accustomed to nimble, lightweight fighters approached it with a mixture of awe and trepidation, invariably asking the same question. This thing actually flies. It did fly, and at high altitude it flew like nothing else. In the thin stratosphere where other fighters gasped for oxygen and lost performance, the Thunderbolt remained powerful and fast. But mastering this beast proved to be a lethal challenge. As the first production models reached training units in late 1942, the P-47 quickly earned a terrifying reputation as a killer of its own pilots. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Major Hubert Hub Zemke, experienced a brutal introduction to their new mount. The aircraft's immense torque from its powerful engine and massive propeller made it unforgiving on takeoff, prone to violent ground loops and torque rolls that could send the 7-ton machine cartwheeling down the runway. Its high landing speed and poor forward visibility over the long nose resulted in countless accidents. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost an appalling 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents before ever seeing a German fighter. The Thunderbolt was killing more Americans at home than the Luftwaffe could hope to in their first months of combat. The pilots hated it. They had dreamed of flying sleek, agile machines like the British Spitfire, the thoroughbred of the skies. Instead, they were saddled with what they mockingly called the 7-ton milk jug, or simply the jug. It was heavy, it was clumsy at low altitudes, and it had a vicious streak that punished the slightest mistake with death. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would later become one of America's greatest aces, described his first flight with a sense of pure terror. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive, he recalled. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The aircraft was a monument to American engineering philosophy. If a problem couldn't be solved with elegance, it would be solved with overwhelming brute force. The P-47 was over-engineered in every respect. It was armored like a flying tank, with a thick steel plate behind the pilot's seat, an armored headrest, and bulletproof glass in the windscreen. Its construction was so robust that it seemed indestructible. But this ruggedness came at the cost of the very qualities a fighter pilot traditionally valued: agility, climb rate, and maneuverability. As the 56th and other fighter groups prepared to deploy to England, a cloud of doubt and fear hung over them. They were being sent to fight the world's best pilots in an aircraft that many of them believed was a fundamentally flawed, overweight, and dangerous design. They were being handed a hammer and told to fight a duel against fencers. How could a machine that killed its own inexperienced pilots in the relative safety of training ever hope to survive against the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe? The answer was hidden within the very flaws that made the pilots despise it, a secret that would only be revealed in the crucible of combat. The first combat missions of the P-47 Thunderbolt in April and May of 1943 seemed to confirm every German prejudice and every American fear. The Thunderbolts were simply outclassed. In turning fights, the nimble Focke-Wulf 192nd could maneuver inside the P-47's wide turning circle with ease, positioning themselves for a killing shot. In a climb, the lighter Messerschmitt 109nd could rocket away, leaving the heavy American fighters struggling below. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses, luring the Jugs into low-altitude turning battles where their weight became an insurmountable disadvantage. The German aces, men like Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jägerschwader 26, reported back to headquarters with triumphant confidence. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," Priller wrote. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer fat targets, pretending to be warriors." The grim statistics backed up his assessment. In their first full month of operations, American P-47 groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The mood in the American bases was somber. Pilots returned from missions shaken, having seen their comrades picked off by enemies they couldn't see and couldn't outmaneuver. The promised superfighter felt like a death trap. But amidst the losses and despair, a strange and unsettling pattern began to emerge, a detail that German intelligence, in its confidence, failed to fully appreciate. The P-47 seconds that were shot down were absorbing an unbelievable amount of punishment before they fell. Reports from returning pilots describe seeing their wingmen's aircraft riddled with cannon shells, chunks of the fuselage blown away yet continuing to fly for precious minutes, often allowing the pilot to bail out or reach friendly territory. One P-47 returned from a mission on May 4th with 21 separate 20mm cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes damage that would have caused a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt to disintegrate in midair. The massive air-cooled radial engine, lacking the vulnerable liquid coolant systems of its German and British counterparts, could shrug off direct hits that would have seized a liquid-cooled engine in seconds. The aircraft was a beast to fly, but it was built like a fortress. This extraordinary durability, however, was a defensive characteristic. It saved pilots, but it didn't win battles. That perception would begin to change on June 26, 1,943 inches, an encounter that would become a legend in the 8th Air Force. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was flying at the tail end of a formation returning from an escort mission near Forges-les-Eaux. Without warning, his group was bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 192nd from Jägerschwader 26, diving out of the sun with a massive speed advantage. Johnson's P-47 was caught in a hailstorm of fire. In the first few seconds, his aircraft was catastrophically damaged. Multiple 20mm cannon shells exploded across his fuselage and wings. The canopy shattered, spraying him with plexiglass shards. Hydraulic fluid erupted from severed lines, coating his windscreen and blinding him. Fire broke out behind the instrument panel. Wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson's first instinct was to bail out. He jettisoned what was left of his canopy, but it wouldn't release. A cannon shell had exploded in the track, welding it shut. He was trapped inside a burning, dying aircraft at 27,000 feet. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson pushed the nose down, trying to escape. What happened next defied all known principles of aerial combat and aircraft resilience. Despite having almost no forward visibility, an engine that was shaking itself to pieces, and controls that barely responded, Johnson managed to keep the battered P-47 flying, pointing it toward the English Channel. Then a lone 190 spotted the crippled straggler. The German pilot, confident he was finishing off an easy kill, positioned himself behind Johnson and opened fire, pouring his entire ammunition load of 20mm cannon shells into the helpless Thunderbolt. Johnson could only hunch behind his armor plate and wait for the end. The aircraft shuddered violently with each impact, but it kept flying. The German pilot, his cannons now empty, repositioned and fired again with his machine guns. Still, the jug flew on. In utter disbelief, the German pilot pulled up alongside Johnson's cockpit. Johnson, looking through the shattered oil-smeared glass, could see his attacker's face clearly young blonde, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to utter confusion. The German shook his head in amazement, gave Johnson an informal salute, and peeled away completely out of ammunition, and having witnessed the impossible. Johnson nursed the flying wreck across the channel, landing at the emergency field at RAF Manston. Ground crews stopped counting the holes in his aircraft after they reached 200. The right wing's main spar was nearly severed. 3 of the 4 primary structural longerons in the fuselage were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The story of Johnson's survival sent a shockwave through both air forces. American engineers realized they had built something far tougher than they knew. German intelligence, receiving the combat report from the pilot who had expended his entire ammunition load on a single P-47, initially refused to believe it was possible. But the evidence was undeniable. The Thunderbolt had a secret. Its greatest perceived weakness, its immense size and weight, was the source of an incredible hidden strength. It could absorb punishment on a scale that no other fighter could endure. This single incident did not change the P-47's tactical disadvantages, but it planted a crucial seed of an idea. It wasn't about surviving a beating. The real question was, could this incredible durability be turned into a weapon? If the P-47 could take a punch like a heavyweight, perhaps it was time to stop trying to box like a lightweight. The miraculous survival of Robert Johnson's P-47 was a testament to its construction, but sheer toughness was not a winning strategy. The key to unlocking the Thunderbolt's lethal potential was not found in the chaotic dogfights over France, but in the controlled scientific environment of high-altitude performance testing back in the United States. Months before the 56th Fighter Group ever deployed to England, test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio were systematically pushing the new fighter to its absolute limits, and in doing so, they stumbled upon a terrifying and revolutionary secret hidden within the laws of physics. On November 13, 1942, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer were tasked with exploring the P-47's high-altitude dive characteristics. Climbing their P-47Cs to 35,000 feet, they pushed the joysticks forward and aimed their 7-ton machines nearly straight down at the Earth. What they experienced next would prove crucial to understanding both the P-47's capabilities and its deadly limitations. As the Thunderbolts plunged earthward, their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 miles per hour, then 600, eventually indicating an astonishing 725 miles per hour. While Republic Aviation would later sensationally claim their pilots had broken the sound barrier, post-war analysis confirmed this was an instrumentation error caused by the extreme conditions. The true airspeed was likely in the range of 550 to 600 miles per hour. But what mattered was not the exact speed, but the violent aerodynamic phenomena it created. As the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound, both pilots encountered a terrifying condition known as compressibility. Shock waves began to form on the control surfaces, rendering them useless. The control stick in their hands went rigid, completely unresponsive to their inputs. They were trapped in a near-vertical dive, accelerating continuously with no apparent way to pull out. Both pilots experienced tunnel vision from the extreme G-forces and the genuine primal terror of being passengers in a machine plunging toward its own destruction. The aircraft had become a projectile, and they were strapped inside. But both Comstock and Dyer managed to recover, and the technique they used would become a life-saving procedure taught to every P-47 pilot. They discovered that instead of panicking and yanking on the frozen stick, the The correct procedure was to maintain steady, firm back pressure while leaving the trim tabs untouched. As the aircraft descended into the denser air of lower altitudes, typically below 15,000 feet, the compressibility effects would gradually diminish. The shock waves would dissipate and the elevators would slowly, almost sluggishly, begin to respond again. The pilot could then complete the pull-out maneuver that subjected both man and machine to bone-crushing forces exceeding 7 or 8 times the force of gravity. Both pilots bottomed out their recoveries with less than 2,000 feet to spare their bodies compressed deep into their seats. When they landed and reported their harrowing experience, engineers immediately recognized the significance. The P-47, due to its immense mass and clean aerodynamic profile, could dive faster than any contemporary fighter. And crucially, its incredibly robust structure could withstand the violent stress of both the dive and the subsequent high-G recovery. Further analysis revealed a counterintuitive secret. The P-47's thick wing, the very feature that gave it a poor turning radius and made it a clumsy dogfighter, actually delayed the onset of the most critical compressibility effects. Thinner-winged fighters like the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt would experience control reversal or structural failure at speeds the P-47 could handle with relative ease. The Thunderbolt wasn't just able to dive fast, it was uniquely designed to survive the dive. This discovery was a revelation. The aircraft's greatest perceived liability, its weight, was the source of its greatest tactical advantage. In a dive that mass translated into kinetic energy on an epic scale, a P-47 at 3,000 feet possessed an enormous amount of potential energy. By converting that potential energy into kinetic energy in a dive, it could achieve speeds that no German fighter could safely match or evade. The Focke-Wulf 190's dive speed was limited to around 450 miles per hour before it encountered severe control issues and the risk of structural failure. The Messerschmitt 109 was even more limited. The P-47 could blow past these limits with impunity. They had discovered a weapon hidden in plain sight, a tactical advantage rooted not in maneuverability but in the simple, brutal physics of gravity and mass. This knowledge, however, was just a piece of data, a report from a test flight. Transforming this physical principle into a coherent, war-winning tactical doctrine would require a commander with the vision to see its potential and the iron will to force his skeptical pilots to fight in a way that defied every instinct they had. The discovery of the P-47's incredible diving capability was a scientific fact, but in the spring and summer of 1943, it was a fact that seemed to have little practical application. American pilots were still dying, still being outmaneuvered by the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe. A test pilot's report from Ohio meant nothing to a terrified novice being hunted by Focke-Wulfs over France. It would take a leader of extraordinary vision and ruthless pragmatism to bridge the gap between theoretical physics and battlefield reality. That leader was Colonel Hub Zemke, the commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group. A pre-war professional officer, Zemke was not a flamboyant ace, but a cold, calculating tactician. He possessed a brilliant engineering mind and an absolute intolerance for failure. When his group arrived in England, he saw the fear and doubt in his pilots' eyes, and he knew that if they continued to fight the Germans on their terms, his command would be systematically annihilated. Zemke initiated a process of intense, methodical analysis. He treated the problem not as a question of courage or skill, but as an engineering equation. Every night he would debrief his pilots, poring over combat reports, gun camera footage, and maintenance logs. He meticulously charted every engagement, altitude, speeds, angles of attack, and outcomes. A clear and devastating pattern quickly emerged. Every time his pilots tried to engage in a traditional turning dogfight with a German fighter, they lost. The P-47 was simply too heavy and slow to maneuver. But in the few instances where his pilots had managed to achieve a significant altitude advantage and dive on an enemy, the results were dramatically different. The attacks were successful, and more importantly, the American pilots survived. Zemke recognized that the P-47's flaws and strengths were two sides of the same coin. Its weight made it a poor turner, but a spectacular diver. Its poor low-altitude climb rate was offset by its superb high-altitude performance thanks to its turbo supercharger. Based on this analysis, Zemke began to formulate a new and radical tactical doctrine, a set of rules that ran contrary to every lesson of aerial combat learned since the First World War. He essentially outlawed the dogfight. His pilots were forbidden from engaging in turning fights. They were forbidden from following German fighters down to low altitudes where the P-47's disadvantages were most pronounced. Instead, Zemke preached a new gospel, the gospel of the vertical fight. The rules were simple, brutal, and uncompromising. First, gain altitude. Altitude was life, a bank account of potential energy that could be converted into speed at any moment. His group would climb to 3,000 feet or higher before ever reaching the combat zone. Second, maintain disciplined formation, providing mutual support. Individual heroics were discouraged. Coordinated lethal teamwork was demanded. Third, and most crucially, when the enemy was spotted below, the only acceptable form of attack was a high-speed dive. Pilots were to roll in, plunge downwards at maximum power, fire a concentrated burst from their 8 machine guns, and then without hesitation use the immense kinetic energy from the dive to zoom climb back to the safety of high altitude. Never stay and fight. Strike like a thunderbolt, then vanish back into the heights. It was a tactic of assassination, not a duel. This new doctrine, which would become known as boom and zoom, or energy fighting, was met with deep skepticism and resistance from his own pilots. They were fighter pilots trained in the romantic tradition of the dogfight, the swirling close-quarters ballet of death. Zemke's tactics felt like cowardice. They were being told to attack with overwhelming advantage and then run away. Many pilots found it difficult to abandon their instincts to resist the urge to turn and mix it up with the enemy. On June 13, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Johnson scored his first kill by diving on an FW-190, but in the excitement, he broke formation and was nearly shot down himself. He returned to base a hero, only to be harshly reprimanded by Zemke and his squadron leaders for his lack of discipline. The message was clear: the system was more important than individual success. Discipline was survival. Zemke drilled his men relentlessly. In training missions over England, he would lead them in endless repetitions of the diving attack and zoom climb until it became second nature. He was a harsh taskmaster, demanding a level of precision and discipline that many pilots chafed under. But he knew he was not just training them to fly. He was reprogramming their combat instincts, forcing them to trust the cold logic of physics over the hot-blooded desire for a fight. Zemke's leadership transformed the 56th Fighter Group. They began to think of the sky not in 2 dimensions, but in 3. They became masters of energy management, using their aircraft's weight and power to control the vertical plane, a domain where the Luftwaffe could not follow. They learned to see their massive P-47 seconds, not as clumsy milk jugs, but as projectiles, guided missiles of immense power waiting to be unleashed from the heights. The group's kill-to-loss ratio began to slowly, then dramatically improve. They were no longer just surviving, they were starting to win. Zemke had forged a new weapon, not by modifying the aircraft, but by modifying the minds of the men who flew it. He had a theory, a radical doctrine that seemed to work in small-scale encounters over the French coast. But soon, this new way of fighting would face its ultimate trial by fire deep in the heart of Germany, in one of the largest and most brutal air battles of the entire war. By August of 1943, Colonel Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had honed their new vertical tactics in skirmishes over the French coast, but the doctrine remained largely unproven on a grand scale. The theory was sound, the training relentless, but the question lingered: could these hit-and-run tactics truly protect a massive bomber formation under assault by hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters? The answer would come on August 17, 1943, a day that would go down in the annals of air warfare as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious and dangerous mission to date, a massive dual-pronged raid against critical industrial targets deep inside Germany. One force of bombers would strike the Messerschmitt aircraft factories in Regensburg, while a second larger force would target the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, the heart of the German war machine's production. The mission was a desperate gamble. The targets were so deep inside the Reich that the bombers would have to fly for hundreds of miles beyond the range of their fighter escorts. The P-47 seconds of the 56th and other groups were assigned to provide penetration support, escorting the bomber stream as far as their fuel would allow before being forced to turn back, leaving the bombers to fend for themselves in the most hostile skies in the world. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned to the Regensburg Force. As they crossed into German airspace, Hub Zemke positioned his squadrons at 3,000 feet, a full 5,000 feet above the lumbering B-17 flying fortresses they were tasked to protect. From this commanding perch, they were a silent, unseen threat. Below them, the German air defense system was reacting with furious efficiency. From airfields across Belgium and Germany, waves of Luftwaffe fighters began to climb, timing their attacks to hit the bombers precisely at the point where their P-47 escorts would be at the limit of their range, low on fuel and forced to break off. It was a perfectly laid trap. German commanders had planned to let the American escorts exhaust themselves and then fall upon the unprotected bombers with overwhelming force. What they hadn't planned for was Zemke's gospel of the vertical fight. As approximately 40 Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds began to assemble below, preparing to climb into attack positions, Zemke gave the order. Across dozens of miles of sky, multiple flights of P-47 seconds executed the maneuver they had practiced into instinct. They rolled inverted, keeping the enemy in sight, and plunged downwards. The 7-ton fighters accelerated with terrifying speed, their engines roaring at maximum power. They weren't engaging in a fight. They were an avalanche of steel and lead falling out of the sun at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. The German pilots focused on the bombers below were caught completely by surprise. One moment they were climbing confidently into position. The next their formations were shattered by diving attackers, moving too fast to track, let alone evade. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, leading a flight from the 63rd Squadron, picked out the 4-190 of Major Wilhelm Willy Galland, a 55 Victory ace and brother of the famous General Adolf Galland. Mahurin executed a textbook diving attack, closing to point-blank range and unleashing a devastating burst from his 8 50 caliber guns. Galland's Focke-Wulf didn't just get shot down, it disintegrated in a fireball of vaporized metal and fuel. The psychological impact on the remaining German pilots was profound. One of their most experienced and decorated leaders had been killed by an attack he never saw coming. The engagement lasted for a chaotic 20 minutes, a swirling high-speed battle fought not in graceful turns, but in brutal vertical plunges and soaring energy-retaining climbs. The P-47 pilots struck hard, fired their bursts, and then, ignoring the instinct to stay and fight, pulled back on their sticks, converting their dive speed into a zoom climb that carried them back up to the safety of altitude. Ready to dive again, the Germans were trapped in an impossible situation. If they stayed low to attack the bombers, they were defenseless against the diving Thunderbolts. If they climbed to engage the P-47 seconds, they burned precious fuel and exposed themselves to attack during their slow ascent, while the American fighters could simply climb higher using their superior turbo-supercharged performance. In this vertical arena, the Thunderbolt was king. When the 56th Fighter Group finally reached the limits of their fuel and turned for home, they left behind a shattered and disorganized German defense. The group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed for the loss of just 3 P-47 seconds. While the unescorted bombers would later face a horrific ordeal over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 56th had proven conclusively and bloodily that their radical doctrine worked. They had demonstrated that the P-47, when flown correctly, was not a clumsy defender, but a lethal predator. The laughter that had filled Luftwaffe ready rooms just a few months prior was now being replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. The flying milk bottle had teeth, and they were sharper than anyone had imagined. But the secret to this newfound lethality wasn't just the dive itself. It was what happened at the bottom of the dive in the final terrifying seconds of the attack. The high-speed dive was the tactic that delivered the P-47 to its target, but it was the aircraft's unprecedented firepower that ensured the target's annihilation. The heart of the Thunderbolt's lethality lay in its armament, a battery of 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 nestled in each wing. In an era when European fighters were increasingly reliant on heavy, slow-firing cannons, the American decision to equip their premier fighter with 8 heavy machine guns was seen by many as a step backward. German pilots confident in the explosive power of their 20mm and 30mm Meningelschuss cannon shells initially dismissed the American 50 caliber as a glorified rifle round. They were about to receive a brutal education in the mathematics of destruction. A single 50 caliber bullet was indeed less destructive than a single cannon shell. But the P-47 wasn't firing a single bullet. It was firing a torrent, a solid stream of lead and incendiary chemicals that German pilots would come to call Roosevelt's piano for the distinctive hammering sound of the 8 guns firing in unison. Each of the 8 M2 machine guns was capable of firing at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. When synchronized, this created a combined rate of fire of over 6,400 rounds per minute, or more than 100 projectiles per second. This was a volume of fire that no other single-engine fighter in the world could match. But sheer volume was only part of the equation. The true genius of the system lay in the concept of convergence. Before each mission, armorers would harmonize the guns, angling them slightly inward so that their streams of fire would intersect at a predetermined point in front of the aircraft. A pilot could choose his preferred convergence distance, typically set between 250 and 400 yards. At this precise point, the firepower of all 8 guns was concentrated into a devastatingly tight pattern, a zone of destruction roughly the size of a barn door. Anything that entered this zone, even for a fraction of a second, would be subjected to an impact of catastrophic force. The effect was less like being shot and more like flying into a solid wall of metal. The ammunition itself was a product of America's vast industrial capacity, a marvel of mass-produced lethality. While German pilots had to carefully conserve their limited cannon ammunition, typically just 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm weapon each, P-47 carried a staggering 425 rounds per gun for a total of 3,400 rounds. This gave American pilots the luxury of maintaining sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in a high-speed aerial engagement. The standard combat load was a carefully mixed belt of ammunition types designed not just to puncture, but to shred, ignite, and utterly destroy. The belt typically consisted of a pattern of armor-piercing AP Incendiary 1 and armor-piercing Incendiary Tracer APIT rounds. The armor-piercing rounds could punch through German engine blocks and cockpit armor. The incendiary rounds, filled with a compound that burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, were designed to ignite fuel tanks and hydraulic fluid. The tracers provided a visible guide for the pilot's aim and had their own incendiary effect. When this mixture struck an enemy aircraft, the result was horrifyingly effective. The AP rounds would create the holes, and the incendiary rounds that followed would pour through those holes, turning the inside of the aircraft into an inferno. Gun camera footage from P-47 seconds provides a visceral testament to this destructive power. German fighters caught in a Thunderbolt's gun sight don't gracefully trail smoke and spiral downwards. They explode. Wings are literally sawn off the fuselage. Tail sections disintegrate. Cockpits and engine compartments are shredded into a cloud of metal confetti. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories all in a P-47, described the effect. When you hit them with all 8, he stated, they don't just go down, they blow up. I saw a 109 literally cut in half the tail, falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him. This ability to deliver a knockout blow in a single short burst was perfectly suited to the high-speed boom and zoom tactics. A P-47 pilot diving at 500 miles per hour had only a 1 or 2 second window to fire. He didn't have time for precise aimed shots with a cannon. He needed to guarantee a kill in that fleeting moment. The 50 seconds provided that guarantee. They created a probability cloud of destruction that compensated for the challenges of high-deflection shooting, ensuring that even if the pilot's aim wasn't perfect, enough projectiles would strike the target to ensure complete obliteration. The German pilots who had once mocked the American machine guns were now learning to fear them above all else. They discovered that while their cannon shells might cause more damage per hit, the sheer density and relentless hammering of the .50 caliber fire was far more likely to find a critical component, a fuel line, a control cable, the pilot himself, and bring about a kill. The wall of lead was proving to be a far more effective weapon in practice than the golden BB of a cannon shell was in theory. It was this weapon, combined with the tactics that delivered it, that would begin to turn the tide of the air war. With a revolutionary tactical doctrine and an armament of overwhelming destructive power, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was transformed from a liability into an exceptionally lethal weapon system. But a weapon is only as effective as the warrior who wields it. In the summer and fall of 1943, the pilots of the 56 Fighter Group, having survived their brutal baptism by fire, began to master the art of the vertical fight. They evolved from frightened novices into confident, calculating hunters. The P-47, once despised, became an ace-maker, propelling a generation of American pilots into the ranks of aviation legends. Their names, Johnson, Gabreski, Mahurin, Schilling, would become synonymous with the Thunderbolt's dominance, each of their victories a testament to the deadly effectiveness of Hub Zemke's tactical gospel. Their individual stories chronicle the group's journey from skepticism to mastery, each combat a near-perfect execution of the new way of war. Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who had miraculously survived being turned into a flying sieve in June, became one of the doctrine's most ardent and effective disciples. He had learned the hard way that a P-47 could not outturn a Focke-Wulf, but he also knew better than anyone that it could absorb incredible punishment. This knowledge gave him a unique brand of courage. On October 10th, 1943, during a massive air battle over Münster, Johnson demonstrated his newfound mastery. His squadron intercepted a formation of approximately 40 German fighters, swarming a group of withdrawing B-17 seconds. In the swirling chaos that followed, Johnson remained disciplined, refusing to be drawn into turning fights. He kept his energy high, repeatedly climbing above the fray and then diving back in. In the space of 25 minutes, he executed 3 separate perfect diving attacks. He destroyed a Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine destroyer, then a Focke-Wulf 190, and finally another Bf-110, bringing his total score to 5 confirmed victories and making him an ace. Unknown to him at the time, one of his victims that day was Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, the commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, and one of Germany's most celebrated aces, a man with 206 aerial victories. The student had just slain the master, using tactics the master could not comprehend or counter. Then there was Francis Gabi Gabreski, a pilot of Polish descent who flew with a cold, relentless aggression. Gabreski became a master of the high-speed deflection, shot a skill perfectly suited to the P-47's diving attacks. On November 26, 1943, while escorting bombers near Bremen, he demonstrated the lethal efficiency of the Thunderbolt. Spotting a group of Messerschmitt Bf-110 seconds climbing to attack the bombers, Gabreski led his flight in a diving attack from 2,8000 feet. He singled out a target, calculated the angle and speed in a fraction of a second, and squeezed the trigger. His combat report was a model of clinical precision, fired a short burst at 45-degree deflection, observed multiple strikes on the cockpit and left engine. The enemy aircraft exploded and fell away in pieces. He then used his excess speed to zoom climb, reposition, and repeat the process, destroying a second Bf-110 within 2 minutes. These 2 victories achieved on a single pass earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. Gabreski would go on to become the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, and every single one of his 28 victories was achieved from the cockpit of a P-47. Walker Bud Mahurin was another of the 56 star pupils. An aggressive and intuitive pilot, Mahurin had a knack for finding himself in the right place at the right time. During the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, he was credited with the probable destruction of the German ace Willi Galland. By October 4, 1943, on a mission to Frankfurt, he was already an established ace. His flight spotted a large formation of German fighters, including over 50 Bf-110 seconds, forming up to attack the bomber stream. Mahurin led the charge, diving from over 3,000 feet. He described the attack as a turkey shoot. The German twin-engine fighters, laden with rockets and heavy cannons, were slow and unmaneuverable compared to the diving Thunderbolts. Mahurin destroyed 3 enemy aircraft in a single engagement, his 8 .50 calibers tearing the heavily armed German destroyers apart. His combat reports, like Gabreski's, highlight the sheer violence of the P-47's firepower. Saw strikes all over the fuselage and wings. The left wing separated completely. The aircraft tumbled out of control. He would finish his tour with 21 victories, a pioneer of the tactics that were now becoming standard procedure. These pilots and dozens like them were not just getting lucky. They were executing a system, a lethal methodology that exploited fundamental laws of physics. The typical engagement followed a brutally effective script. They would climb to a commanding altitude, often above 3,000 feet. They would spot the enemy below, roll their heavy fighters over, and dive. In that dive, the P-47 transformed. It shed its sluggishness and became a guided projectile, a 4-ton battering ram hurtling earthward at over 500 miles per hour. The German pilot below would have only seconds to react. Evasion was nearly impossible. The closing speed was too great. The American pilot would line up the shot, squeeze the trigger for 1 to 2 seconds, unleashing a hurricane of steel, and then pull back on the stick. The Thunderbolt, its immense energy intact, would convert that speed back into altitude, soaring up and away from the fight, leaving a flaming wreck in its wake. The entire sequence from initial roll-in to regaining altitude often took less than 90 seconds. It was a brutally efficient, almost industrial process of destruction. The P-47 wasn't dogfighting, it was harvesting. And as the aces of the 56th perfected this new art, the shockwaves of their success began to ripple through the entire German fighter command, forcing a painful and terrifying reevaluation of their new American adversary. For the pilots of the German Jagdwaffe, the summer and fall of 1943 was a period of profound and terrifying confusion. They were the undisputed masters of aerial combat, veterans of 100 battles, flying what they knew to be the finest fighting machines in the world. Yet something had gone terribly wrong. The clumsy, overweight American Indianer that they had mocked and slaughtered with ease in the spring were now fighting with a discipline and lethality that was deeply unsettling. The Americans were refusing to fight fairly. They refused to be drawn into the swirling close-quarters turning battles where German skill and the superior agility of the 4-190 and Bf-109 should have been decisive. Instead, they remained high above untouchable, appearing only as fleeting dark shapes against the sun, before plunging down with impossible speed, striking with shocking violence, and then vanishing back into the heights. It was not a style of combat the Germans recognized, and it was costing them dearly. The psychological impact on German pilots was immense. An aerial duel, for all its lethality, was a contest of skill. A pilot could see his opponent react, maneuver, and fight for his life. But these new American tactics removed skill from the equation. German combat reports from the period are filled with accounts of bewilderment and shock. Pilots would be scanning the sky, focused on their primary mission of attacking the bombers, when suddenly their wingman's aircraft would simply cease to exist, disintegrating in a flash of orange flame and black smoke. There was no warning, no chance to evade. The attack came from above, from their blind spot, and it was over in an instant. This new threat bred a pervasive sense of helplessness. It was like being hunted by an invisible sniper. The sky, once their domain, now felt charged with a new and unpredictable menace. They began to call the P-47 seconds die Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devils, a name born of fear and a grudging respect for their newfound deadliness. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, encountered the 56th Fighter Group in the late summer of 1943. He survived, but the experience left a lasting impression. In a post-war interview, he recalled the shift in German thinking. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. At first, someone might laugh and say, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche faster than our controls could respond. The first pass might destroy 3 of our fighters. Just gone transformed into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. To be caught in that stream for even a second meant instant death." Rall understood that the Americans had changed the geometry of the fight. The battle was no longer being fought on a horizontal plane of turns and counterturns, but on a vertical axis of speed and energy, an axis where the heavy Thunderbolt held an insurmountable advantage. If German fighters climbed to meet the P-47 seconds, the American fighters would simply climb higher, their turbo-supercharged engines giving them superior performance in the thin air above 2,500 feet, where German engines began to struggle. The only partial solution German units developed was to attack the bombers in quick slashing passes from the side or below, and then dive away before the high-cover P-47 seconds could intervene. But this gave the German pilots less time for accurate aiming and exposed them to the increasingly dense defensive fire from the bombers themselves. The loss of experienced leaders to these new tactics sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. The deaths of aces like Willy Golland and Hans Philipp were not just tactical losses, they were devastating blows to morale. These were men who had been held up as invincible heroes, masters of their craft. If they could be swatted from the sky by these brutish American machines, what chance did a newly trained pilot have? The German High Command, initially dismissive, was forced to conduct a serious technical evaluation of the P-47. The report delivered to a furious Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was a sobering document. It confirmed the Thunderbolt's service ceiling of over 4,200 feet higher than any German piston engine fighter could reach. It confirmed its incredible dive speed and structural strength, and it detailed with alarming clarity the devastating and concentrated firepower of its 8 heavy machine guns. Goering, who had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever cross the German border, now faced the reality that American fighters could not only escort those bombers deep into the Reich, but were systematically destroying his elite fighter force in the process. The fear was not just of the machine, but of the cold, disciplined methodology behind its use. The Americans were fighting like a perfectly synchronized machine. Their attacks were coordinated, their formations disciplined, their adherence to their new doctrine unwavering. This was not the individualistic, almost chivalrous approach of the German aces. This was something new, something industrial and terrifyingly efficient. The sound of the diving Thunderbolt, the deep thundering roar of its massive engine, and the percussive hammering of its 8 guns became a sound of impending doom. On the ground, German soldiers began to listen for it. In the air, German pilots began to look for it, craning their necks to scan the empty sky above, knowing that the most dangerous enemy was the one they couldn't see, lurking in the glare of the sun, waiting to fall upon them like judgment from heaven. The era of German aerial supremacy was over, and the pilots of the Luftwaffe knew it. But even as they struggled to adapt to this new vertical threat, the Americans were about to introduce a new innovation that would eliminate the Thunderbolt's last significant weakness and turn their vertical advantage into absolute crushing dominance. By the winter of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt, guided by Hub Zemke's vertical fighting doctrine, had established itself as a lethal high-altitude predator. In a dive, it was untouchable. At altitude, its turbo-supercharged engine gave it a clear performance advantage. But the aircraft still possessed a critical, often fatal flaw, a poor rate of climb. While the P-47 could regain altitude efficiently after a diving attack using its stored kinetic energy in a zoom climb, its initial sustained climb from takeoff or from medium altitudes was still painfully slow compared to its lighter German adversaries. This meant that if a P-47 pilot was caught out of position at a lower altitude, he could not simply climb away from trouble. He was vulnerable. The Luftwaffe knew this, and their tactics evolved to exploit it, attempting to catch the Thunderbolts during their laborious ascent to their preferred hunting grounds above 3,000 feet. This single performance deficiency was the last great hope for German fighter pilots. That hope was about to be extinguished by a seemingly simple but revolutionary piece of engineering. The solution arrived in the workshops of the American propeller manufacturer Hamilton Standard. Engineers working to maximize the efficiency of the P-47's monstrous R-2800 engine developed a new type of propeller. Early P-47 models used a conventional Curtiss electric propeller. The new design was a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, but with a crucial modification. Its blades were massive, broad-chord blades shaped like giant paddles. The new propeller was 13 feet in diameter, and its huge paddle-like blades were designed to bite into the air with unprecedented authority, converting more of the engine's immense horsepower into raw thrust. When this new propeller was fitted to the P-47D-22 production block in late 1943, the result was nothing short of a transformation. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolt models had an anemic climb rate of around 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the new paddle blade variants could achieve over 3,000 feet per minute. Suddenly, the P-47 could match or even exceed the climb rate of the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 at most altitudes. The first squadrons to receive the new paddle blade P-47 seconds in England in early 1944 could scarcely believe the difference. The aircraft felt lighter, more responsive. It leaped off the runway instead of lumbering. The slow, vulnerable climb to altitude was replaced by a powerful, confident ascent. The massive propeller also dramatically improved acceleration and level flight, allowing pilots to build and regain energy much faster. It was, for all intents and purposes, a new airplane, and the Germans were about to discover this in the most brutal way possible. Hauptmann Heinz Pritzelbeer, a 221 victory German ace, was one of the first to experience the shock. In February 1944, while leading his squadron of 4 192nds against a bomber formation, he spotted a group of P-47 seconds below them, a classic setup for a German attack. He led his men in a diving pass, expecting the Thunderbolts to scatter or try to dive away as they always did. Instead, the American fighters did something utterly unexpected. They turned into the attack and began to climb. Bear, confident in his 190 superior climbing ability, engaged in a climbing race intending to get above the P-47 and attack from its vulnerable rear. To his astonishment, the fat American fighter stayed with him, its huge propeller clawing at the air, its nose pointed skyward. The P-47 not only matched his climb, it began to gain on him. For the first time, a German pilot discovered he could not escape a Thunderbolt by going up. The encounter ended in a stalemate, with Bear breaking away in confusion, but the report he filed sent a ripple of alarm through the Luftwaffe command. The paddle blade propeller did more than just improve performance. It changed the very sound of the Thunderbolt. The tips of the massive blades spinning at high RPM approached the speed of sound, creating a deep, distinctive, thundering roar that could be heard for miles. It was a sound of immense power, a threatening rumble that became the P-47's acoustic signature. German ground troops learned to identify approaching Jabos fighter bombers by this sound alone, a sound that meant death was coming from the sky. They called it Donnerschlag, the thundercloud. With this final piece of the puzzle in place, the P-47 had become the complete weapon. It had superior high-altitude performance, superior dive speed, superior structural strength, superior firepower, and now a competitive rate of climb. There was no longer any corner of the sky where a German fighter was safe. The Americans now owned the vertical dimension completely. They could climb with the Germans, and they could dive away from them. This newfound capability would arrive just in time for the largest, most decisive air offensive of the war, a concentrated 6-day assault on the German aircraft industry that would become known to its participants simply as Big Week. The Luftwaffe was about to face the perfected Thunderbolt flown by 1,000 seasoned veterans, and the result would be nothing short of annihilation. By February 1944, the stage was set for the final, decisive battle for control of the skies over Germany. The Allied command planning for the D-Day invasion knew that air superiority was not just an advantage, it was an absolute prerequisite for success. The German Luftwaffe, though battered, remained a potent threat capable of inflicting crippling losses on the daylight bombing campaign. To break its back once and for all, the Allied air forces planned a massive, concentrated offensive codenamed Operation Argument. For 6 consecutive days, from February 20th to February 25th, the 8th Air Force would launch over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties against the heart of the German aircraft industry, targeting assembly plants, engine factories, and component manufacturers across the Reich. The objective was simple and brutal: to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition, a battle the Germans, with their dwindling supply of experienced pilots and limited production capacity, could not possibly win. This period would become known to the aircrews as Big Week, and it would be the P-47 Thunderbolt's crowning moment of air-to-air supremacy. The 56th Fighter Group, now equipped with the new paddle-blade P-47 seconds and staffed with a cadre of combat-hardened veterans, flew 16 major missions during Big Week. The tactics that Hub Zemke had pioneered and his aces had perfected were now standard doctrine across all P-47 groups. The pilots flew with a new swaggering confidence. They were no longer the frightened novices of 1943. They were the masters of the high-altitude fight, and they were eager to prove it. As the massive bomber streams crossed into Germany, the Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. Every available fighter was scrambled to defend the homeland. The result was a series of titanic air battles, the largest the world had ever seen, fought in the frozen skies 6 miles above the earth. But this was not the Luftwaffe of 1940. Their ranks were increasingly filled with inexperienced pilots, products of a hastily accelerated training program, often with less than 50 hours of flight time in their high-performance fighters. They were thrown into combat against American pilots, who now averaged over 150 hours of training before arriving in Europe, and who had now flown hundreds of hours in combat. This chasm in experience, combined with the perfected P-47 and its lethal doctrine, created a recipe for slaughter. On February 20th, escorting B-17 seconds to Leipzig, the 56th Fighter Group tore into the German defenders. They claimed 15 German fighters destroyed without a single loss. The next day, over Brunswick, they claimed 23 more. On February 22nd, escorting bombers to Halberstadt, they destroyed another 12. The combat reports from this period read like a litany of destruction. The German formations, desperately trying to break through to the bombers, were systematically dismantled by the diving Thunderbolts. The sky over Germany became a chaotic maelstrom of burning aircraft, blossoming parachutes, and crisscrossing tracer fire. Robert Johnson, now a captain and one of the leading aces of the 8th Air Force, described the fighting as a wild, exhilarating, and terrifying melee. He and his squadron would dive into a formation of 50 German fighters, fire their bursts, and zoom climb back into the sun, leaving chaos and flaming wreckage in their wake. They were fighting with a level of coordinated aggression that the Germans simply could not counter. The accumulated effect of these losses during Big Week was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. They lost hundreds of aircraft, but more critically, they lost hundreds of pilots, including many of their remaining experienced squadron leaders and instructors. These were men they could never replace. The German training pipeline, already strained, broke completely. New pilots arriving at frontline units were now little more than cannon fodder lambs sent to the slaughter against the veteran wolves of the American fighter groups. They lacked the situational awareness to spot the diving P-47 seconds. They made critical errors in defensive maneuvering, and they panicked under the relentless pressure. They would often dive away reflexively, a fatal mistake that played directly into the P-47's greatest strength. By the end of Big Week, the German fighter arm had been bled white. It had ceased to be an effective, cohesive fighting force. While German fighters would continue to appear in the skies over the Reich until the final days of the war, they would do so in smaller numbers and with noticeably less aggression. The battle for daylight air superiority over Germany had been fought, and it had been won. On March 6, 1,944 inches, the ultimate demonstration of this new reality, American bombers struck Berlin for the first time in a massive daylight raid. The P-47 seconds of the 56th Fighter Group escorted them all the way to the German capital and back, and incredibly, they did not encounter a single German fighter willing to engage them at high altitude. The Luftwaffe had learned through brutal, painful experience that to challenge the P-47 seconds above 25000 feet was an act of suicide. The sky over the Third Reich now belonged to the Americans. The strategic bombing campaign could now proceed with devastating, unchecked efficiency, systematically destroying the industrial capacity that sustained the German war effort. With their primary mission of air superiority largely accomplished, the pilots of the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt would soon be turned loose on a new set of targets, a role that would make their name feared not just by German pilots in the air, but by every German soldier on the ground. With daylight air superiority over Germany effectively achieved by the spring of 1944, the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt underwent a fundamental transformation. While still a formidable high-altitude escort, its primary mission shifted from the sky to the earth. The same qualities that had made it a dominant air-to-air fighter, speed, ruggedness, and overwhelming firepower, made it an exceptionally terrifying ground attack aircraft. P-47 units, particularly those of the 9th Air Force, were increasingly tasked with interdiction missions seeking out and destroying German military assets on the ground. The Thunderbolt, the Jug, became the Jabot, a German slang term for Jagdbomber or fighter-bomber. For the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, this new threat would become a relentless daily nightmare, a psychological terror that paralyzed movement, shattered morale, and systematically destroyed their ability to wage war. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns, so devastating against aircraft, proved equally effective against ground targets. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could easily penetrate the thin top armor of German half-tracks, trucks, and even some light tanks. A 2-second burst could pour over 100 projectiles into a target the size of a supply truck, turning it into a flaming wreck. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the Thunderbolt into a true multi-role weapon of destruction. The P-47D-25 variant could carry a staggering ordnance load 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder on a centerline rack, a bomb load comparable to that of a light bomber from the early years of the war. Later, the aircraft was fitted with launching stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets HVARs. Each of these rockets delivered a warhead with the explosive power of a 105mm artillery shell, but with the pinpoint accuracy of a diving fighter. A single P-47 could arrive on the battlefield and in a matter of seconds deliver the equivalent of a devastating artillery barrage directly onto a target. The tactics developed for this new role were a direct extension of the vertical fight. P-47 seconds would orbit at high altitude above the effective range of German light anti-aircraft guns, or flak. From this vantage point, they could scan the roads, railways, and fields below, searching for targets of opportunity. When a German column was spotted, the Thunderbolts would roll in from above, entering a steep 60-degree dive. This high-angle approach not only increased the accuracy of their weapons, but also made them an incredibly difficult target for German gunners on the ground. They would release their bombs or fire their rockets from an altitude of 4,000 to 6,000 feet. And then using the speed from their dive, they would zoom climb back to the safety of altitude before the flak crews could effectively track and engage them. After delivering their heavy ordnance, they would often make multiple strafing passes, their 8 guns tearing into any surviving vehicles or personnel. For the German soldier on the ground, the experience was hell on earth. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of a Panzer Grenadier regiment during the Normandy campaign, described the attacks in his memoirs. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying, the engines roaring, the rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass by a flight of 4 fighters. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. Wehrmacht movement during daylight hours became virtually impossible. A simple order to move a company from one village to another became a suicidal undertaking. The Jabos seemed to be everywhere, circling like vultures, ready to pounce on any sign of movement. The distinctive thundering roar of the P-47's engine became the soundtrack of defeat, a sound that sent soldiers diving for cover into ditches and culverts. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, saw the P-47 seconds unleashed with their full fury. Over 500 Thunderbolts helped form an impenetrable air umbrella over the invasion beaches, massacring the few German fighters that attempted to intervene. In the critical weeks that followed, as German reinforcements tried to move toward the Normandy front, they were systematically hunted and destroyed by the Jabos. The statistics from this period are staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed the destruction of over 650 locomotives, 3 800 trucks, 500 tanks and armored vehicles, and thousands of horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht, an army that still relied heavily on horses for transport, was being pushed back into the 19th century by an enemy wielding the full force of 20th century industrial air power. The Germans tried everything to counter the Jabo threat. They camouflaged their vehicles, mounted more anti-aircraft guns on their tanks and half-tracks, and restricted all major movements to the hours of darkness. But it was a losing battle. The P-47 was simply too fast, too tough, and too numerous. The German soldier was trapped, unable to fight, unable to move, unable to hide from the thunder that constantly rolled in the skies above him. But even as the Thunderbolt was cementing its reputation as the master of the battlefield, a new and revolutionary threat was emerging from secret German airfields, a weapon so advanced it threatened to make all propeller-driven fighters, including the mighty P-47, instantly obsolete. As the Allied armies pushed across France in the late summer and fall of 1944, a new and deeply alarming sight began to appear in the skies over Germany. Allied bomber crews and fighter pilots returned to base with incredible stories of enemy aircraft moving at impossible speeds, without propellers trailing faint streams of smoke. These were the first encounters with the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied propeller-driven fighters, the Me-262 was a quantum leap in aviation technology. On paper, it was an invincible superweapon, a machine that threatened to sweep the P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds from the sky and reverse the course of the air war. The Thunderbolt, the king of the piston engine era, now faced a threat from the future. The question was, could the brute force of the propeller age stand against the blinding speed of the jet age? The initial encounters were deeply one-sided. Me-262 seconds would slash through bomber formations and their escorts with impunity, their speed so great that American pilots could barely track them, let alone engage. The jets were untouchable. They could enter and leave combat at will, their heavy 30mm cannons devastating the B-17 seconds. The morale of Allied air crews, so high after achieving air superiority, began to falter. A sense of technological dread set in. Had the Germans produced a wonder weapon that could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? The Allied command recognized the threat and immediately began developing tactics to counter it. Intelligence analysis and combat reports revealed that the revolutionary German jet had critical vulnerabilities. Its Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to flaming out, and had a slow throttle response. This made the Me-262 extremely vulnerable during its long takeoff runs and its slow, careful landing approaches. The airfields where the jets were based became the new front line in the air war. P-47 units were tasked with flying airfield patrols, loitering near known Me-262 bases, waiting for the jets to take off or land. This was incredibly dangerous work, flying deep in enemy territory in predictable patterns exposed to Germany's formidable flak defenses. But it was effective. Many jets were destroyed on the runway or shot down as they circled to land slow and helpless. However, Thunderbolt pilots soon discovered another far more audacious way to kill a jet: to hunt it down in its own element. While the P-47 could not match the Me-262 inches level flight, it still held one crucial advantage: its incredible diving speed. P-47 pilots, masters of the vertical fight, realized that if they had a significant altitude advantage, they could dive on a jet and for a brief period match its speed. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group was one of the first to prove the theory. Leading his squadron of P-47 seconds at 2,800 feet, he spotted an Me-262 flying several thousand feet below. Meyer didn't hesitate. He rolled his Thunderbolt over and plunged into a full-power dive. His airspeed indicator climbed past 450, then nudged 500 miles per hour. The jet pilot, confident in his superior speed, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's 8.50 calibers opened up from 400 yards. The result was catastrophic. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire, Meyer wrote in his combat report. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. To counter the jet threat more effectively, a specialized variant of the Thunderbolt was rushed into service in early 1945. The P-47M was the ultimate expression of the Jug's design. It featured a more powerful R2800 engine with water methanol injection that could boost its output to a staggering 2,800 horsepower for short periods. With refined aerodynamics and this immense power, the P-47M could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 3,000 feet, making it the fastest piston engine fighter of the war and fast enough to intercept jets under certain conditions. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, the pioneers of P-47 tactics, were the first to receive the new M model. They became the dedicated jet hunters. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Squadron, shot down two Me-262 seconds in March 1945. His tactical assessment highlighted the clash of philosophies. The jets are faster, he reported, but they can't turn, and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery, and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack the bombers. That's when we get them. The P-47's robust construction and overwhelming firepower were once again proving to be the decisive factors. The delicate, technologically advanced jets were no match for the brutal sledgehammer blow delivered by the 8 Browning machine guns. The Me-262, while a technological marvel, had arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. Its failure was not just a failure of production, but a failure to overcome the sheer bloody-minded effectiveness of the machine everyone had once laughed at. The Thunderbolt had proven it could not only dominate its own generation of fighters, but could hold its own against the next. But the ultimate reason for the P-47's triumph lay not just in its design or tactics, but in the unstoppable industrial force that had created it. The success of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the skies over Europe was not just a story of a superior weapon system or a brilliant tactical doctrine. It was the story of a victory forged in the fires of American industry. While German engineering produced technologically advanced and formidable aircraft, it was a boutique, almost artisanal enterprise compared to the colossal, relentless output of the American arsenal of democracy. The ultimate defeat of the Luftwaffe was not inflicted by a single ace or a decisive battle, but by the crushing, inexorable weight of an industrial avalanche that buried the Third Reich under a mountain of steel, aluminum, and lead. The P-47 itself was a masterpiece of mass production. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, and a second massive plant built from scratch in Evansville, Indiana, became monuments to American industrial efficiency. At the peak of production in 1944, these two plants were completing one P-47 Thunderbolt every hour around the clock. By the end of the war, 15683 P-47 seconds had been built more than any other American fighter model and more than Germany's entire production of its two primary fighters, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, during the same period. Each P-47 was a complex machine requiring over 65000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and thousands of hours of skilled labor. Yet American workers, many of them women, who had never set foot in a factory before Pearl Harbor, assembled these intricate machines with a speed and quality that stunned German observers. This industrial might extended to every component of the war effort. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines were produced in such vast quantities that the 8th Air Force could afford to run them at punishing war emergency power settings that would have destroyed less robust German engines. Knowing that a replacement was always available, the production of .50 caliber ammunition was equally staggering. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, each firing thousands of rounds, ammunition consumption reached over 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone produced 30 million rounds monthly, each cartridge a miniature marvel of precision engineering. And the fuel to power this vast air armada, over 25 million gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline consumed monthly by the 9th Air Force alone, was produced in American refineries and shipped across the Atlantic in a continuous convoy of tankers. Even more impressive was the production of pilots. By 1944, the United States was graduating 3,000 fully trained pilots annually, more than Germany had trained in the entire war. Each American pilot arrived in the European theater with a minimum of 400 hours of flight time, including extensive training in gunnery instrument flying and formation tactics. By contrast, the depleted German training program was rushing pilots to the front with less than 100 total hours, turning them into easy victims for the experienced Americans. The ultimate demonstration of this industrial disparity came on January 1, 1945 during Operation Bodenplatte. In a final desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe launched a surprise attack with nearly 900 fighters against Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands, hoping to destroy the Allied air forces on the ground. At Airfield Y-34 near Metz, home of the P-47 seconds of the 365th Fighter Group, the attack was initially a success, destroying 22 Thunderbolts. A captured German pilot brought before the base commander, Major George Brooking, gestured at the burning aircraft and taunted. What do you think of that? Brooking's calm reply became a legend in the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already clearing the wreckage. By tomorrow, he said, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The German pilot's smirk vanished. He knew the truth. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 seconds were being flown in from depots in England to replace every aircraft lost. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, had lost 271 aircraft and critically 213 pilots, including many of their last remaining instructors and squadron leaders. They were losses from which the Jagdwaffe would never recover. The battle was a tactical surprise for the Allies, but a strategic catastrophe for Germany. It proved that even a successful German attack was ultimately a defeat. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with functionally infinite resources. The German pilots who had once laughed at the flying milk bottle now understood the terrifying truth. Oberleutnant Josef Pips Priller, the same ace who had mocked the P-47 inches 1,943, gave a statement to German propaganda officials in March 1945. Deemed too demoralizing for publication, it revealed the complete reversal in German attitudes. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built, Priller stated. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it is gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. They hadn't just been defeated by a better tactic or a tougher airplane. They had been buried by a system, an overwhelming force of production that rendered their bravery and skill ultimately meaningless. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had completed its incredible journey from an object of ridicule to one of the most dominant and decisive weapons of the Second World War. The final statistics of its service were a stunning testament to its effectiveness. In the European theater alone, P-47 seconds were credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They obliterated nearly 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and over 8,600 railway cars, effectively paralyzing the German transportation system. They achieved a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in aerial combat while suffering the lowest loss rate of any major Allied fighter bomber. The Jug, the fighter nobody wanted, had become the workhorse of the Allied victory. Its story is the ultimate triumph of analysis over assumption of disciplined doctrine over improvisation, and of industrial might over tactical brilliance. After the war, captured German aviation leaders were interrogated, and their assessments revealed the profound impact the P-47 had on their thinking. General Adolf Galland, the former head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, provided the most eloquent summary. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he admitted. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right." Galland's words captured the essence of the P-47's victory. It had won not by playing the Germans' game of elegant maneuvering dogfights, but by creating a new game, one based on the brutal physics of energy and mass. The lessons learned in the skies over Europe with the P-47 fundamentally changed the future of fighter design and air combat doctrine. The post-war analysis was unambiguous. The age of the pure turning dogfighter was over. The future belonged to aircraft that emphasized speed, climb, rate, and energy management. The boom and zoom tactics pioneered by Hub Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group became the new paradigm. The jet fighters that emerged in the post-war era, from the F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea to the fighters of the modern age, are all direct descendants of the P-47's tactical philosophy. Speed is life. Altitude is an advantage. He who has the most energy dictates the terms of the fight. Francis Gobreski, the P-47's top ace, would go on to fly F-86 Sabres in Korea, applying the exact same energy-fighting principles he learned over Germany. He would shoot down 6.5 MiG-15 seconds, becoming one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 different wars. The aircraft had changed, the speeds had increased, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Today at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits in quiet tribute. Its massive radial engine is silent, its 8 guns inert, but its powerful, imposing presence still tells a story. It is a story of how a group of American pilots, faced with a machine that seemed designed for failure, refused to accept defeat. Through rigorous analysis and iron discipline, they discovered its hidden strengths and developed the tactics to exploit them. They proved that an aircraft's true capability matters infinitely more than conventional wisdom about what a fighter should be. They started diving straight down because analysis showed it was the most effective way to attack. They continued diving straight down because combat results proved the analysis correct. And they achieved kill ratios that approached 2:0 to 1-inch ideal conditions because physics and proper tactics, executed with unwavering discipline, are more powerful than courage and tradition alone. That was the secret the 56th Fighter Group discovered. That was the tactical revolution that helped win the war. And that was why the laughter of German aces in the spring of 1943 had turned into a permanent, terrified silence by the spring of 1945. The thunder had spoken.